Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. I am Daniel Drezner from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I blog at foreignpolicy.com.
And I am the very shamefaced Heather Hurlburt at the National Security Network, who blogs at Democracy Arsenal, tweets at NatSec Heather, and proved herself to be such a disastrous non-Jedi master of 21st century technology that a brilliant hour of Blogging Heads repartee between Dan and myself, including the best humble brag in all time and the second best humble brag of all time, were lost to your listening ears a week ago.
My dear readers, we cannot possibly recreate the awesomeness that was that humble brag session.
It's a tragedy on par with the loss of the Alexandria Library.
I have to agree, but let's just say that at various points, John Huntsman's name was dropped by both of us, as well as, multiple name dropping of when I was at the White House. And I'm not going to say who it was by, but, it was epic. It was on an epic level. And, by the time you would have finished that hour, you would have either, have just been laughing or have been throwing things at your computer screen. But it was epic, truly.
I indulged in a whole spree of Washingtonian behavior that I normally mock and make fun of. So I think we have to conclude that the gods were punishing me.
That might very well be it. But we can actually continue the conversation that we were having last week. The topic du jour back then was basically sort of Mitt Romney's foreign policy acumen, and as it turns out, the NATO summit, which has it concluded?
You didn't even notice, did you?
Let's be honest. Really, name me one thing of import that happened at the summit. I will say that the NATO summit always reminds me. Alan Beatty, a couple of years ago, wrote a great little sort of generic news, like mock news reportage of what happens with the summit, any kind of summit communique that Gideon Rockman once posted on the Financial Times, and it has this wonderful line like, "We are very seriously concerned about this serious outbreak of seriousness," and it just perfectly captures any G8 or NATO summit, in perpetuity. But that said, Romney wrote a op-ed in the Chicago Tribune, I believe, on this summit, and I suspect you didn't like it.
Well, the first thing that I found astonishing about the Romney response was the statement that the campaign put out, which didn't mention Afghanistan. That, of course, one of the main subjects of discussion at the summit was Afghanistan, that alliance and other foreign forces are giving an extra 39,000 troops. That mean 39,000 Americans don't have to be in Afghanistan, and yet there was no mention of it, which I have to say, I can be snide all day about it, but I conclude that the reason was that there wasn't agreement among the warring factions of Romney advisors on what to say about the alliance's agreement on sort of how they're steadily and jointly moving toward the exits, and so thus it was better to leave it out. But it was a sort of evidence of fundamental non-seriousness about, what are we using this alliance for, and we can't even talk, or one of our two political parties can't even talk about what we're using it for.
Yes, that was a bit problematic. I went to town on the op-ed as well. It really, I don't know how to put this. I don't have a problem with I do have a problem with it, but I kind of shrug off sort of hyper hawkish rhetoric during the campaign because I'm not sure how much it really counts for. I think the thing that I did find a little disturbing about the NATO op-ed was the total lack of logic that was going on in that thing. There's just no other way to put it, because he was saying, so NATO is broken, which is a fair, he's fair to say that there's problems in NATO, and I don't disagree with some of the diagnosis, but he said, so the way to cure it is, first, Europe needs to spend more on defense, and second, the U.S. needs to spend more on defense, and that'll solve everything. Which I'm not entirely sure he understands how NATO traditionally has worked, which is whenever the U.S. ramps up its military spending, generally the allies are going to think, oh, great, we don't need to worry about this. So they're not going to spend anything necessarily. And not to mention that he was talking about NATO, playing a role in North Korea and countering China. And, I understand out of theater operations, but I can put it no other way than saying, what the fuck?
Well, I actually think you may have hit on a really fantastic idea for a second-term Obama. Should we have such a thing? Which is that he could appoint Romney as a special envoy for burden sharing, and he could go around Europe and use his Bain consulting expertise to explain to the Europeans how they should be handling their defense better and spending more money. And I'm sure he'd find as welcome and hospitable a response to that as Secretary Gates did when he went around Europe, both for his Republican president boss and his Democratic president. I mean, look, you know as well as I do that trying to get the Europeans to spend more money on their own defense is the bane of the existence of every president and his Europe staff. And so, that's kind of a cheap applause line. In my sort of old-fashioned, you don't say rude things about guests while they're in your house, it was a tacky applause line to use while the Allies were here. It was further mendacious because of the rhetoric suggesting that somehow President Obama is responsible for the sequester and for the cuts of the defense cuts that are threatened in the sequester, where, my memory tells me that was a bright idea that they had up in Congress.
Yeah, that's a fair point. That was certainly valid.
And I kept imagining myself a European sitting in Chicago reading that and trying to think what I was gonna, how I was gonna explain to my leadership what the hell this actually meant and what it meant that we should be planning for in the event of a Romney election, which, gets to a topic that you and I were debating a little bit about on Twitter earlier today, that Aaron Miller over at Foreign Policy has published an article referring to something called the Barack O'Romney foreign policy, saying that the foreign policy of the two is basically indistinguishable, which I actually object to on substantive grounds, and I will go into greater length on that. But there is also the question, if, say, on Iran, on Afghanistan, one candidate can't actually enunciate a policy alternative that when you get past all the rhetoric sounds very different, how much does political rhetoric, how much does campaign rhetoric actually matter?
I am making a giant zero sign at the camera. I think this has been a consistent theme of mine, which is I really don't think that campaign promises on foreign policy, and let me be very clear here, I'm making a distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy. I think the campaign pledges of domestic policy actually do count for a fair amount because voters remember that stuff. Voters don't care about foreign policy, let's be blunt. And so as a result, I do think that by and large what campaigns say about foreign policy doesn't in the end matter that much. And again, let's go back to what happened in 2008. I think we've had this conversation before. But, if Barack Obama had actually implemented the foreign policy that he claimed he was going to in 2008, I think the U.S. would have renegotiated NAFTA. Obama would have been happy to have sat down with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. To be fair, he did say he would go into Pakistan to get bin Laden, so you got to give him credit on that one. That was a campaign pledge he actually kept to. And I think, kudos for that one. But, I think there's two levels on this. The first is that, let's face it, campaigns often say a lot of things on foreign policy. They never have any intention of implementing. This is entirely an exercise in pleasing various constituencies in their own party. And then there are the times where perhaps the rhetoric is actually genuinely intended. In other words, the candidate or whoever's coming up with the rhetoric really does think they're going to do that. But what happens is that even if they make even a slight move towards implementing it, the cruel shoals of foreign policy reality hit them in the face, at which point they then realize that even if they want to do this policy, like, let's say, closing down Guantanamo Bay, it's not going to happen for a whole variety of political realities, both domestic and international. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would just add one category to what you're saying, which is that, and the Obama campaign in 2008 were masters at this, of making statements that suggested a really different approach without necessarily pledging. So, for example, Obama never said he would sit down with Ahmadinejad without any precondition, that he would sort of in fact, I think you can argue that what they've done, that they made some attempts, and what they got were the terrible 2009 elections, which pretty much made it impossible to sit down with anybody. That I think they could make a strong case that what they've done is pretty consistent with what they've said they would do. But And you see the Romney people trying to do that this time around, to not actually promise to do things that at least some people on the advisory team know to be crazy. Like, for example, say, on my first day in office, we will bomb, pick your favorite nuclear site in Iran, but at the same time trying to ratchet up the rhetoric to please the domestic constituency groups that you're talking about. And this is where I disagree with you, because foreigners care about foreign policy insofar as it tends to be their domestic policy. So, there is, I think, one sort of ripped from the headlines example is today you have negotiations opening up with Iran and the so-called P5+1 group of international interlocutors, which look like they went pretty well and look like they're opening up a process, and the two sides have exchanged proposals and counter-proposals, and no one's hair is on fire, which suggests... At the same time...
I have to say that's a low level of standard to define success, but I will grant you they seem more promising than they've seen in quite some time.
We're just out of the habit of watching how diplomacy works, and that is how diplomacy works. The it doesn't suck standard is really not to be minimized. Sorry for that. That was inappropriate. Sorry for the children in the audience.
I dropped the F-bomb earlier. Come on, you are very pretty.
At the same time, how are the Iranians supposed to understand some of these key Romney advisors with a piece in the Wall Street Journal today basically saying, negotiations, there's no point here. There should be no flexibility. There should be no ability to respond to anything. There should be no easing up on the sanctions. And that piece makes total sense in the context of a campaign and trying to put Obama in a political box. And, it's a reasonable strategy from a Republican point of view. I see why they're doing it. But if you're actually trying to have negotiations and make the Iranians believe that in exchange for giving us what we want, they can have something they want, that's a terrible way. It's a terrible way to run a business. So it does have effects. It has effects on the Israelis. It has effects on the Europeans who, I was just thinking the other day that incredible set of discussions in the primaries, I think, that was kicked off by Herman Cain saying, if I were president, we wouldn't need to bail out Europe. And obviously that's not serious, and no serious person is going to pay attention to that. But then that pushed Romney into a more problematic position on Europe, where every banker that's supporting Romney knows in his or her heart that if the euro really started to go down the drain, we'd have to step in for the sake of our own banking sector, right? Those guys all know that, as much as it pains them. But to the extent that the European markets start to believe that maybe there's some doubt about whether a Romney administration would do that, that potentially has really lousy consequences that bite you and me in the pocketbook. So, the rhetoric on foreign policy is not as free as we like to think that it is.
Okay, I will push back on you very strongly, because I think you're actually adopting I think you're actually way underestimating the acumen of, in fact, the rest of the world when it comes to U.S. campaign rhetoric. I mean, this is not their first go-around when it comes to a presidential election. So, for example, first of all, let's bear in mind, even during during the 2008 campaign, correct me if I'm wrong, was it Austin Goolsbee that got into trouble because it was revealed that he had talked to a Canadian official and actually said, yeah, of course the NAFTA stuff is rhetoric. We're not really going to, open that up for negotiation.
Yes, I had forgotten that.
Yes. So, first of all, I mean, there's actual direct things. So my hunch is the Europeans are not wigged out at all about this, because probably if there is a sotto voce message is, look, we're just running a campaign here. And we can say the situation has changed when we're elected, so I'm not worried about that. And even the Iranians, I would argue, I grant you they might view, the United States through a somewhat different lens, but, even they, are probably, right, because they're right now in the middle of doing it domestically, recognize the difference between talking domestically versus what actually happens when they're in power. So I grant you that occasionally rhetorical things make the ground a little tougher to patch up. And by that standard, you really, in that sense, do have to give Romney credit, because he has managed to piss off China, Russia, and Europe. So, in the span of 2 months, which is pretty cool if you think about it. I mean,
Okay, so here's my question for you. if you assume a Romney presidency, right, then you assume something of a tidal wave that changes sort of the very close, slightly favoring Obama numbers that we've been seeing for a while. And you assume that with that tidal wave comes a Republican tidal wave that takes over the Senate and maintains the majority in the House. Okay. Now think about who those people are. Okay, those candidates, those incumbents. And then think about that those are the people at whom this rhetoric is directed. And, yes, I believe that, as I said, Mitt Romney in his heart knows that we'd have to bail out, that we'd have to support Europe if they needed it economically. Knows in his heart that when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is saying it's not a good idea to bomb Iran, that it's really not a good idea to bomb Iran.
Can I just say, I think you've come up with a great new campaign pledge or slogan for the Romney campaign. In his heart, he's saying. In his heart,
we're betraying our age, though, Drezner. For those of you who don't know the reference, that's Barry Goldwater. Whose slogan was it about Goldwater? In your heart, Goldwater's slogan was "In your heart, you know he's right."
In your heart, you know he's right.
And his opponent's slogan was "In your heart, you know he's nuts." And I hasten to add that I was the child of political parents, and although I certainly was unaware of this at the time, I was drinking it in.
Ha! I was not even alive then, so... Gotcha, Hurlburt.
Wait a minute, Drezner. When were you born?
I was born in 64.
Yeah, so was I.
Okay, this is 64.
Yeah. In utero, man. Right. In utero.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I was born with actually my son will claim, he was not a he was not a Red Sox fan in like 1999 or something, and I'll say, well, of course you weren't. You weren't even a twinkle in your parents' eye at that point. But he thinks his sports allegiances are sort of retroactive before his birth. What's the more serious point I was trying to make? So anyway, those folks are going to get to town, and as Obama found out with Guantanamo, they are going to have some say over what happens and what doesn't happen, and the rhetorical expectations that Romney is, in the same way that a lot of Obama supporters think they heard him say things that he didn't quite exactly say, and we're very disappointed that he didn't do those things. Romney's going to have some trouble with the people who are going to be in control of the House and the Senate, the same ones that have been giving, Boehner fits. And they take this rhetoric seriously. They're the ones, as you said, that it's aimed at. So
Okay, I'll push back again, because I understand your points, and I think you're right that in some ways what matters is not just whether Romney wins, but whether he also controls Congress.
And if he does, he will. There's no scenario under which Romney wins and doesn't control Congress. Okay.
I think there are two ways to think about this. The first is that in contrast, again, to domestic policy, I think the GOP is a little more split on foreign policy. So as a result, I don't think there's a uniform foreign policy approach that you're going to see in Congress. Because, in some ways, it's divided very strongly between, let's say, the sort of neocon hawks versus what I can only describe, not exactly Ron Paul types, but certainly people that have had their fill of war and simply, are almost, not isolationists, that's not exactly the right word, but people who simply don't want to, bother getting involved in another sort of long-term and costly military operation overseas. So I think that gives Romney some space to maneuver. The second thing is that, and this might be, maybe this is an asymmetric constraint, I don't think Republican presidents are as bound or as hampered by Congress as Democrats are.
That is a really interesting theory that I would love to test out in some alternate universe where I didn't have to live in the country while it was happening.
Right. But
no, your first point, the party is absolutely divided, but Congress not so much. And as you saw last week, we had the extraordinary spectacle of the Senate leadership pulling an amendment asking the president to hasten the withdrawal from Afghanistan because they were scared it would pass. And so there you had, the neocons saying, okay, Ron Paul Republicans, you've had your fun, now shut up and go home. And that happened on issue after issue in the voting on the Defense Authorization Act, where you had an alliance of Democrats and Tea Party Republicans and the Republican leadership monitoring very carefully to make sure that no amendment where that alliance was too strong was allowed to come to a vote.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I still don't. I mean, look this way. First of all, and you know as well as I do that an awful lot of the foreign policy, the president controls a lot of foreign policy without even needing to go to Congress. And second, that I think Romney can live with a certain amount of foreign policy criticism from his right, I guess would be the way to put it. And indeed, in some ways, it actually helps him if he gets that criticism, because it makes him seem like the moderate, calm leader above all. And also, as I said, I think the second point, and here I'm literally sort of developing this in real time, I really do think that, and maybe this will change post-Obama, but for a long period of time, Democrats constantly had, when they were in power, had to be afraid of looking weak in terms of foreign policy crises. The notion was that they didn't take defense seriously, they didn't take security seriously. That, I think, to Obama's credit, that advantage has been erased. But for a long period of time, that was what they always had to worry about with dealing with Congress. I think Republicans always got a free pass on that. And so in that sense, I don't think Romney's going to be any different.
Well, as I say, it would be fascinating to see as a political science experiment. It won't surprise anyone to know that I'm hoping to not actually have to see it. I guess, back to Aaron Miller's original thesis, as much as I love Aaron, there are two things that I really object to. And one is that anytime you get to this place of just words don't matter, I think we're in a dangerous place. And yes, I know it's politics and whatever, but, words do matter. And then the last thing that I think has to be said is that it's fun to have this kind of blasé, I'm so sophisticated, I notice there's no difference. But if you happen to be one of the thousands of women around the world who relies on U.S. family planning assistance and would be affected by the global gag rule, there damn well is a difference. If you think that calling the Russians, geopolitical enemy number one, and there, I actually think that, given that Romney has over and over again come out with these kind of truly crazy positions on Russia and arms control with Russia and working with Russia, then that you can't write that one off as pandering for domestic benefit anymore after it's been done that many times. So I would argue there are some significant differences, and they matter for real people and real people's lives, and they matter geopolitically.
Okay, I'm somewhat sympathetic to this. I'll try to defend Miller's thesis in two ways. The first is, I think one of his points, which I think you would probably concede, is that to some extent his point is really not so much about Romney, but rather in some ways the continuity between, let's say, the second term of George W. Bush and then what Barack Obama did on a whole variety of issues. And that in some ways that the surprise isn't so much that, that Romney is like Obama, but rather that Obama has pursued a fair number of policies that conservatives actually, by and large, are pretty comfortable with. And also, I think one of the things, Miller didn't say this, but I think he should have, which is one of the reasons why they look similar, is less about the parties and more about the overwhelming public consensus of no more wars. So, in some ways, first of all, Obama's been, very aggressive in terms of prosecuting the war on terror, and been certainly successful. But the other thing is that he's also been very aggressive in getting the United States out of Iraq, and setting up the stage for the United States to get out of Afghanistan. And those are overwhelmingly popular policies, to the point where even if Romney doesn't want to do them, I think he probably will do them. And these are big, significant things in terms of going to war or not. So I think that's a very large area where, in fact, they actually do have something in common. Or the political constraints are so powerful that they have no choice but to have something in common.
Well, there's a structural argument that Miller doesn't quite make, and that you're making a little more explicitly, which is that the most fundamental determinants of American foreign policy are not elections. And that, I think, is a point that can't be repeated often enough. That the American foreign policy is about things other than elections, and you can take that in a Marxist direction, you can take it in a vulgar Marxist direction, you can take it in all kinds of directions, but yeah. But the other point, which I think, again, back to my words matter, is that some of the stuff that happened in second term Bush, again, happened not so much because it was what the administration wanted to do, and certainly not
but
so
they had
much.
No choice.
Yeah, they had no choice. Not so much because it was what their conservative intellectuals wanted to do, and certainly, I mean, we see, in many ways, Republicans running away from second-term Bush and running away from the second-term Bush advisors, frankly, as fast as they can. Whereas the Obama policies actually do, what they're doing actually does fit with a worldview about, sort of approaching the world with a willingness to negotiate, a willingness to look at others' interests, a willingness to conceive of ourselves as part of a collective leadership instead of the only decision maker in leadership, and the desire to bring to the table as part of that the ability to use overwhelming force in times and places of our choosing. And those two elements together are how I would characterize the Obama foreign policy. And that's profoundly different from the core worldview of Bush, and even more that you see in the Republican rhetoric now, even though the external constraints led them to a lot of the same places.
Well, I would say the following thing. You've actually hit upon the one area where I might agree with you in terms of where they're different.
Change the subject immediately.
Exactly. But, in frustration, because our blogging heads last time didn't get published, I wrote a post, basically talking about sort of turmoil or disorganization or lack of coherence in the Romney foreign policy team last week. And I thought and I basically made these arguments that I think on the whole this stuff doesn't really matter that much. But there is one exception. And that is, and I would have dismissed this out of hand a month ago, and I don't dismiss it quite as out of hand now, based on what I'm hearing. If Romney were to appoint someone like, let's say, John Bolton as Secretary of State, that would actually make a difference. Okay, Bolton's worldview is just a bit out there, and also as someone who had to peruse his memoirs for some research at one point. Holy crap, those memoirs scare the crap out of me. Because there is a borderline delusional aspect to them. Have you ever perused Bolton's memoirs?
I have not, and I salute you as a great American for making the sacrifice in doing that.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I was doing some research on PSI, the Proliferation Security Initiative, and Bolton did play a role in that. But I read that part of it, and then I couldn't stop perusing it because seriously, it's hard for me to describe the way these memoirs are set up. But basically, it's kind of like the conservative doppelganger to Robert Reich's Locked in the Cabinet. If you remember, Reich wrote this memoir about his time as Secretary of Labor during the Clinton years that, he would describe scenes and then there would actually, those scenes, as it turned out, had been videotaped on C-SPAN or something, and they bear no resemblance to the way Reich described them. Reich sort of has them as being, much more extreme. And it's you kind of got that sense with Bolton. Bolton's memoirs consist of the following. An issue comes up. Little State Department folk, propose abject surrender to the Chinese immediately. Bolton, however, stands firm and suggests a much more robust, unilateral pro-American response. The Secretary of State, either via Powell or Rice, I don't know if we can do this. I'm not sure that's a great idea. Bolton carries the day somehow, and then inevitably what happens is that either Powell or Rice go into Bolton's office and say, yeah, you were right. I'm sorry. You're a great American. How could I have not realized that? I mean, and there is just no way any of this, went down the way it did. But if that is actually the way he sees the world, and he were to become Secretary of State, it would be the most interesting, and by interesting I mean batshit scary Secretary of State since Al Haig, is the only way I would describe it.
I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that John Bolton is not going to be Secretary of State. And that in itself would present its own sort of interesting and painful conundrum if Romney were to be elected, watching them try to figure out what they would do with him.
Right. I mean, I think that's the only place he could go. I mean, he's already been UN ambassador. Yeah. He wouldn't take a deputy position. He'd be a horrible subordinate.
How old is he?
I honestly don't know. I want to say 60.
So young enough that there's not an argument that he needs to graduate to the senior statesman role, which is how one sometimes deals with people who fit in that category.
Yeah. And he would be a horrible NSC advisor or something like that. I mean, that would just be disastrous. Maybe you're right. I mean, all I can tell you is that I would have agreed with you there was a zero chance a month ago. The rumblings I have heard
Okay, but this seems, I have to say, this is wildly inconsistent. On the one hand, you say, don't worry, Romney's rhetoric doesn't matter, and then you say, I'm worried that he's going to appoint John Bolton Secretary of State. I mean, pick which one it is.
Well, Secretary of State actually does have, significant operational policy authority. So I do think who you appoint does matter a fair amount in terms of determining foreign policy. And yes, I will grant that words matter to some extent once you actually get into office. My argument before this has been what you say during the campaign does not necessarily mean all that much once you get into office. Once you get into office, if you shoot your mouth off, yeah, that's a problem. I'll completely concede that point. Words do matter once you actually have authority. I don't think they matter as much at the campaign stage.
But words matter because they are indicative of things like whether you would actually consider naming John Bolton Secretary of State, which we both agree would matter. And so I just am not in favor of blowing off the words now because, the argument that I think you're now making is the fact that so many Bolton-esque words are coming out of the Romney campaign is part of some things that you're taking as an indicator that they might actually be willing to put Bolton in its state, and that, to me, that just makes my argument for me right there.
But I guess I think we're disagreeing about is the causal mechanism. You're saying the words matter because they tick off foreign countries, or because it means that
no, I'm saying that words matter because they reflect a reality, that they're not just sort of picked up and going to be discarded. There's a difference between and I'm trying to think of a Republican thing so that I can be consistent and not seem like I'm excusing Democratic behavior and condoning Republican behavior. There's a difference between Romney on China. How's this? Romney says that he will start doing more punitive measures, trade measures against China on his first day in office. Nobody believes he will actually do that. And the Chinese, who, as you said, this is not the first presidential campaign they have watched. The Chinese presumably don't believe it either. So that one, I'm with you completely. If, however, you have a string of Bolton-esque pronouncements coming out of the candidate's mouth, at the same time that you have this behind-the-scenes, not very behind-the-scenes, Romney advisors running to New York Times reporters, for God's sake, and saying, what the hell are we going to do? We can't control our candidate. John Bolton keeps hijacking our policy papers. Then, the rhetoric is a data point about reality.
I grant you that the words to date suggest that at the minimum the Romney campaign is Bolton curious, would be the way I would put it.
Okay, that's just a bunch of really regrettable images. It's really going to ruin the rest of my afternoon right there. Yeah.
I'm going to need a minute to compose myself. Okay.
I'm also going to ponder what the PG link could possibly be for that.
I don't even want to go there.
Okay, so let me rescue you by pointing out that we do have, just today, as I mentioned, we have a fabulous actual real-time negotiation going on with real live Iranians sitting in a room with real live Americans in Baghdad, of all things.
Yes.
Poor Wendy Sherman, who gets the North Korea account, the Iran account, and then where does she get to do the Iran account? In Iraq. You just wonder what sin she committed in a past life.
Yeah, I was going to say there'd better be a nice plum ambassadorship to the Bahamas or something after this.
Yeah, well, this is just back to the problem we were just saying about Bolton. After you've been the number 3 official at the State Department, it's still kind of hard to reward you. Your reward is that you become like Tom Pickering, an elder statesman going around issuing words of wisdom that people don't pay enough attention to.
Right.
But anyway, so this is happening, and the good news is that they seem to have agreed to meet for a second day, that, as I said earlier, they seem to have exchanged proposals and nobody's hair was on fire. The bad news is that this is diplomacy and it works really slowly, and there's a lot of pressure on this problem to be resolved quickly, and expectations that are very, very high for a process that's going to be fraught, and there are going to be missteps along the way, and both sides will probably try to back out of any agreement at least once.
Here's my barometer for the state of the negotiations in Baghdad. The more agitated the Israelis are, I assume the better they're going. That's basically going to be my Geiger counter on this one. So that the more the Israelis say, this is unacceptable, I can't believe this, what the hell, we've been thrown under a bus. The moment they say we've been thrown under a bus, that's when you know the negotiations have succeeded. Because it means they realize a negotiated settlement might actually be possible. I will say that there's been a little more optimism on this than you've heard during previous rounds. I would argue that the need for speed on this is not just on the West side, though. It's also on the Iranian side, which is they really, really, really don't want a variety of EU sanctions to kick in come July 1st. I think particularly they don't want the shipping ones to come in, because one of the things that will happen is that most of the shipping insurance in the world is done through London. And basically, all of those shipping registries have made it clear they will not insure ships carrying Iranian oil going to countries like China and South Korea, which would essentially tighten the embargo, even though that was perhaps a more effective punch than anyone had anticipated. My understanding is one of the carrots that the P5+1 is holding out is to say, look, we will offer a waiver for those, provided you guys don't enrich past 20, or, you pledge not to enrich up to 20%. But I have to say, to date, everything looks like the groundwork has at least been laid for something reasonably positive, because the Iranians are talking smack domestically, which is often what they'll do right before they make a concession. And as you say, the negotiations didn't end today in a horrible way, so that offers the promise of more of these things. I think the interesting question is, how does this get framed, as you point out, by the media? What does success look like beyond the Israelis being pissed?
So one just actual factual data point that I saw today that I thought was really interesting.
Hey, I offered lots of factual data points.
No,
before.
I want to add one factual data point before we go to framing and messaging, which was a piece in Al Monitor saying that the financial market situation in Tehran is the worst it has been since the last days of the Iran-Iraq War. And if you think about sort of how awful, that was a 10-year conflict in which, press ganged teenagers were sent to the front without weapons. So you think about how bad that was. But second, that war ended with a negotiated solution that the Iranians were very reluctant to accept, but ultimately did accept for purposes of the survival of the state. So,
which is what they will do if the survival of the state is at stake.
Yes, and so that I actually think that's a very interesting and relevant and comparison that one hopes bodes well. And as far as the framing is concerned, I've been, and forgive me if I said this on Blogging Heads before, but in the U.S. domestic context, as you said earlier, Americans don't want another war. And you've seen again and again in the polling that Americans don't want to go to war with Iran unless, there's the feeling that war is imminent and Iran has a weapon. Americans don't want the Israelis to take action unilaterally. And this actually remarkably has stayed pretty consistent through all the political backing and forthing, although there are big partisan divides on it. So to me, the question about the framing is really whether that sort of basic public desire to see this get played out peacefully, the Pentagon's desire to see it get played out peacefully, whether that can be matched up with any understanding of just how sort of slow and uneven and ugly and messy diplomacy actually is, and whether we're sort of ready for this kind of diplomacy in the Twitter age. And on the Fabulous Lost episode, we talked a little bit about how Twitter affected the Chen Guangchen situation. And if you think a little bit about how what happens when they first go back to Tehran and the first organ in Tehran says, we think this is a bad idea, and there'll immediately be an explosion of, see, we told you so here. And it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out and whether, I think you have basic acceptance among all non-political segments of American society that a negotiated solution and a sort of slowing things down solution is the right one, given the general war weariness and regional instability. But the ability to use Twitter to trump that is something that I really wonder about.
I mean, I do think it's a deeper issue, though, which is essentially, let's face it, any kind of negotiated settlement And, let's assume, I'll be optimistic and say, okay, there's an arrangement whereby basically the Iranians will, agree to safeguards that pretty much guarantee they're not at least going to be developing a weapon, but they will have probably some sort of nuclear processing or some sort of low-grade arrangement. But the issue is that the deal essentially is one in which the Obama administration or the P5+1 is making a deal with the current regime, thereby recognizing the current regime's right to exist. And that, let's face it, that is the thing that, it causes Israelis to get twitchy and that causes a lot of conservatives to get twitchy. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and there's, I guess there's a relatively new, or Foreign Affairs was anyway trying to remarket as new, a debate on this subject. But, there just isn't, nobody has been able to put forward a strategy on Iranian regime change that shows any prospect of working in the short to medium term. And when you talk to the Iranian dissidents and human rights activists and opposition political leaders that, in principle, are the government, that the U.S. and Israelis and, in general, just people who care about human rights and people not being tortured and executed without trial and underage and all the rest of it, the folks that we'd prefer to see in charge, what they will say to you is, we don't want military action, we don't want lots of aggressive rhetoric about regime change, because frankly that just entrenches the hold of the existing regime, and we'd like you to speak up about human rights violations. We don't want you to be silent on human rights violations, but as far as the political transition goes, we'd kind of like you to keep your hands off a little bit and let us work that out for ourselves, which really ought to be something that makes sense to Americans, because God knows we don't like people intervening in our politics.
Yes, but still, again, you're talking about trying to cut this kind of negotiation during a campaign, during a presidential election campaign. In some ways, any kind of deal that is cut is going to force Romney to reject it and say what we should be doing is changing the regime. And which is great, of course, because if you're running a campaign, you can say that without necessarily articulating exactly how, or you could even articulate how you think you're going to do it without having to worry about what really trying to implement.
Yeah. I think that'll be actually, if Romney, and I actually think his smarter advisors realize this, and the problem of sort of criticizing the president and trying to make him look weak, which is what they feel they need to do on national security, the sort of Rovian strategy of go for your opponent where he's strong, not just where he's weak. But at the same time, Americans don't actually like the whole democracy promotion at the point of a gun thing. It doesn't pull well. And so Romney does not want to get pushed into a place where he is having to spell out sort of a concrete alternative that sounds like democracy at the point of a gun. Because that, the independents are not going to like that. So there,
you're right.
It's going to be challenging, as much as certain wings of the party are spoiling to have this fight. It's going to be challenging for Romney.
Maybe. If I was playing Romney advisor, I would probably say, I can think of two lines of attack. The first is to say, three lines of attack. The first is to say, this deal is dangerous. This deal reminds me of what the Obama administration did in February with North Korea, and look how long that lasted. So let's be blunt. This is a paper, arrangement, with a country that doesn't necessarily honor anything that it necessarily signs. Second, this is yet further evidence that the Obama administration is out of touch with the values of the American people. What the American people want to see is democracy in Iran. They want to see this hideous theocratic regime that wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth gone. I am not saying that we should necessarily use force to do that, but we should use all available measures short of force. If sanctions brought Tehran to the bargaining table, imagine what even tougher sanctions would do to that regime. It would bring it to its knees. And you know what, finally, isn't it really sad that this administration can sit down and compromise with Tehran, but they won't compromise with the Republicans in Congress?
So I am never an Obama surrogate during office hours. And we are taping this during office hours, so I am not an Obama surrogate. But there was.
I am not a Robbie surrogate.
I know
that was pretty badass. I thought.
But the IRS doesn't care what you do, and it does care what I do.
Right. I'm sorry.
But the first response to that is, of course, we can't trust Tehran, and that's why it's so great that we cleverly got the IAEA deal done at the same time. So we'll have inspectors back on the ground that will tell us what the Iranians are doing, which is exactly what the previous administration failed to do and what Governor Romney has no plan for.
I can't believe you're going to put your faith in UN bureaucrats, but go ahead.
Those UN, well, then we send the other advisor off to the side and remind everybody that who the UN bureaucrats are that are doing it, and et cetera, et cetera. But then second point is the one, by the way, that I, as just sort of a person who favors U.S. global engagement and who favors unity and diversity in American society, I'm really concerned about, because that Obama doesn't understand our values stuff is code for, Obama's not one of us, he's a Muslim.
Right.
Maybe he was born in Kenya. But, the response to that is, one of the things that Barack Obama understands very well is that it's much better to have UN inspectors in Iran than U.S. troops firing guns on the ground in Iran, and that Americans don't want that.
That's a good line. I like that. That's actually pretty good. Okay.
And then, my third point is going to be, meanwhile, I'd just like to remind you that every time Governor Romney goes out and talks about war with Iran, the oil futures markets jump 5%, and that shaves another point off the recovery that we're putting through over the objections of Republicans in Congress.
You have to call that the Romney tax on oil.
I like that.
There you go. See?
Speaking of which, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to pivot to Egypt, but it sounds like you had one more good point to make.
No. I was going to say I can offer advice to both sides.
Can we?
I can be politically whore myself.
Can we Chiron your phone number across the bottom of the screen or something?
I should open up a shop, a foreign policy consulting shop. I tell you, I'm under.
I have to tell you, the sad part is you'd find very few takers for that. And the other little secret I have is people who want advice on foreign policy don't want to pay for it.
Yes, I'm not surprised on that.
That's why I'm sitting. That's why the viewers will notice that the wall behind me is white and blank.
Okay. You were going to pivot to Egypt, I believe.
Yeah, I thought we should, since they're having an election today. Somebody had a snide comment. Oh, I guess it was one of the Muslim brothers who said that the people of Egypt had been waiting 7,000 years for this day.
CNN actually had one of the rare, cryon things that I actually thought was really cool, which was, Egypt has first free election in 5,000 plus years. It was a good line, I thought.
Wait, but does that suggest Egypt actually had a free election 5,000 years ago? Forgive my ignorance about this.
No, I don't think it does. I think it might be that CNN misdated the beginnings of the Egyptian era.
Although I do recommend the Stacy Schiff Cleopatra book for interesting reading about how much more evolved freedoms, and particularly gender freedoms, were in Cleopatra's Egypt than they were in the Roman world of the period. Which is one of the reasons that the Romans found Cleopatra so highly dubious, was that girls were educated and women could choose and divorce their husbands.
Oh, well, that's just I don't approve of that at all. So it's just.
But the Egyptian elections are actually, one of the more fascinating things about them is that nobody, including your two blogging heads interlocutors, or maybe especially your two blogging heads interlocutors, has any freaking idea how they're going to turn out.
Yes, and actually they're turning out right now as we speak. So I should stress that probably what we're going to say is overtaken by events by the time the thing gets posted. Yeah. I will say that the smartest thing I've seen on this was a post that my co-blogger at Foreign Policy, Mark Lynch, wrote, which has been that basically the transition has been, all the major players in the transition have acted so stupidly that this just might work. In other words, the military has committed numerous gaffes. The Muslim Brotherhood has committed numerous gaffes. The protesters, the Tahrir Square, misunderstood a whole variety of things. The Salafis have screwed up, you name it. And yet, oddly enough, we're actually in a really competitive election, it seems like. It's not a slam dunk for anyone.
Yeah, and the point that I took from Mark's piece, which I also really liked, was what I was calling the Rip Bin Winkle point, which is that if you had fallen asleep on February 11th, 2011, and woken back up, and look, it's not much more than a year later. They're having elections. They're peaceful. The candidates are very diverse. The outcome is totally unclear. Meanwhile, Egypt has a legislature, and the SCAF, the military rulers, are sticking to their time frame, and that actually is a pretty damn amazing transition. So, whatever the result turns out to be, and I pretty much guarantee that, because basically it's either going to be a candidate who at some time in the present or past has had links to the Muslim Brotherhood, and or a candidate who has said some nationalist things that Americans in the domestic political context will find highly objectionable, because gosh, people never ever say things in talk about the domestic context of elections. So there will be a whole lot of screaming and scare. One thing I predict confidently is that there will be a lot of screaming and scaremongering about how the world is coming to an end, the Israelis should be terrified, and Barack Obama lost Egypt. I think I can predict that with great confidence. And the point that Mark's piece makes is that there turns out to be actually more sort of inherent strength and consistency in Egyptian institutions, both for better and for worse. And I think some of the things that people were really hoping for in the revolution haven't come to pass for exactly these reasons. But the world is not going to end. We're not going to wake up tomorrow morning. Gas will not be cut off to Israel. The peace treaties will not be abrogated. The canal will not be closed. And you will go out to the stoop tomorrow morning, and the paper will still be there.
Hopefully. That last one really does date us, by the way, just so you know. But I would tend to, I don't disagree with those assessments. I think the thing that stood out for me, and I think Gallup had a poll out this week that was also significant on this point, which is I think what seemed disconcerting during the parliamentary elections and during the fall was that there seemed this sort of inexorable trend that the Islamists, and particularly the Salafists, were carving out an ever greater share of public opinion. To the point where the Salafists did far better than anyone expected during the parliamentary elections, and that got a lot of American watchers a little wigged out. And it turns out they've peaked and actually declined, which is interesting. I think that's the most interesting thing.
Something we forget is there's nothing like actually giving people power to start disaffection with them.
Exactly, and so in that sense, I think you're right. I mean, one of the odd things, as it turns out, creating a parliament and giving these guys some responsibility in parliament was really good, because it turns out this is a nice stress test for how are they going to handle the presidency. And then the Muslim Brotherhood screwed up by not saying they weren't going to put a candidate forward and then doing so. And so on the whole, the fact that the election is in doubt, I think, is the best thing that could have happened to Egypt, because it meant that people actually cared about it, and that it didn't seem like it was the fix was in, as it were. And so in that sense, I think you're right, that oddly enough, Egypt seemed relatively promising, in February of last year when Mubarak left. Then it seemed like, it's not going to go the way of Tunisia. And now it actually seems, I think the more interesting question is, if the election goes well and if the transition continues, I think the two interesting questions are, first, will the new president be able to contain what SCAF wants to do? Because it's clear SCAF isn't going to give up, all of its powers to the fight. And then second, traditionally, the region has paid attention to Cairo. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not there's that kind of effect down the road.
Yeah, I would agree. Although I do think that you may end up with a president who actually wants most of the same things that the SCAF wants, which will present its own whole set of challenges.
That is entirely possible. But on that note, I think our time has run out, and hopefully this will actually be uploaded time. Heather,
at which I blush again. But Daniel, it's been terrific, and we will reconvene.
Yes, always a pleasure.
Take care.
All right, best of luck. Oh, and the Red Sox won while we were doing this.
Hey, well, that clearly we need to time it that way more often.
Exactly. All right, take care. Yes, that was a bit problematic. I mean, I went to town on the op-ed as well. It really, I don't know how to put this. I mean, I don't have a problem with I do have a problem with it, but I kind of shrug off sort of hyper hawkish rhetoric during the campaign, because I'm not sure how much it really counts for. I think the thing that I did find a little disturbing about the NATO op-ed was the total lack of logic that was going on in that thing. There's just no other way to put it, because he was saying, so NATO is broken, which is a fair, he's fair to say that there's problems in NATO, and I don't disagree with some of the diagnosis, but he said, so the way to cure it is, first, Europe needs to spend more on defense, and second, the U.S. needs to spend more on defense, and that'll solve everything. Which I'm not entirely sure he understands how NATO traditionally has worked, which is whenever the U.S. ramps up its military spending, generally the allies are going to think, oh, great, we don't need to worry about this. So they're not going to spend anything necessarily. And and not to mention that he was talking about NATO, playing a role in North Korea and countering China. And, I understand out of theater operations, but I can put it no other way than saying, what the fuck?
Well, I actually think you may have hit on a really fantastic idea for a second-term Obama. Should we have such a thing? Which is that he could appoint Romney as a special envoy for burden sharing, and he could go around Europe and use his Bain consulting expertise to explain to the Europeans how they should be handling their defense better and spending more money. And I'm sure he'd find as welcome and hospitable.
Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. I am Daniel Drezner from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I blog at foreignpolicy.com.
And I am the very shamefaced Heather Hurlburt at the National Security Network, who blogs at Democracy Arsenal, tweets at NatSec Heather, and proved herself to be such a disastrous non-Jedi master of 21st century technology that a brilliant hour of Blogging Heads repartee between Dan and myself, including the best humble brag in all time and the second best humble brag of all time, were lost to your listening ears a week ago.
My dear readers, we cannot possibly recreate the awesomeness that was that humble brag session.
It's a tragedy on par with the loss of the Alexandria Library.
I have to agree, but let's just say that at various points, John Huntsman's name was dropped by both of us, as well as, multiple name dropping of when I was at the White House. And I'm not going to say who it was by, but, it was epic. It was on an epic level. And, by the time you would have finished that hour, you would have either, have just been laughing or have been throwing things at your computer screen. But it was epic, truly.
Basically, I indulged in a whole spree of Washingtonian behavior that I normally mock and make fun of. So I think we have to conclude that the gods were punishing me.
That might very well be it. But we can actually continue the conversation that we were having last week. The topic du jour back then was basically sort of Mitt Romney's foreign policy acumen, and as it turns out, the NATO summit, which has it concluded?
You didn't even notice, did you?
Let's be honest. Really, name me one thing of import that happened at the summit. I will say that the NATO summit always reminds me. Alan Beatty a couple of years ago wrote a great little sort of generic news, like mock news reportage of what happens with the summit. Any kind of summit communique that Gideon Rockman once posted on the Financial Times, and it has this wonderful line like, "We are very seriously concerned about this serious outbreak of seriousness." And it just perfectly captures any G8 or NATO summit, in perpetuity. But that said, Romney wrote a op-ed in the Chicago Tribune, I believe, on this summit, and I suspect you didn't like it.
Well, the first thing that I found astonishing about the Romney response was the statement that the campaign put out, which didn't mention Afghanistan. That, of course, one of the main subjects of discussion at the summit was Afghanistan, that alliance and other foreign forces are giving an extra 39,000 troops. That mean 39,000 Americans don't have to be in Afghanistan, and yet there was no mention of it, which I have to say, I can be snide all day about it, but I conclude that the reason was that there wasn't agreement among the warring factions of Romney advisors on what to say about the alliance's agreement on sort of how they're steadily and jointly moving toward the exits, and so thus it was better to leave it out. But it was a sort of an evidence of fundamental non-seriousness about, what are we using this alliance for, and we can't even talk, or one of our two political parties can't even talk about what we're using. Response to that, as Secretary Gates did when he went around Europe, both for his Republican president boss and his Democratic president. Look, you know as well as I do that trying to get the Europeans to spend more money on their own defense is the bane of the existence of every president and his Europe staff. And so, that's kind of a cheap applause line. In my sort of old-fashioned, you don't say rude things about guests while they're in your house, it was a tacky applause line to use while the Allies were here. It was further mendacious because of the rhetoric suggesting that somehow President Obama is responsible for the sequester and for the cuts of the defense cuts that are threatened in the sequester, where, you know, my memory tells me that that was a bright idea that they had up in Congress.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And that was certainly valid.
You know, and I kept imagining myself a European sitting in Chicago reading that and trying to think what I was gonna, you know, how I was gonna explain to my leadership what the hell this actually meant and what it meant that we should be planning for in the event of a Romney election, which, you know, gets to a topic that you and I were debating a little bit about on Twitter earlier today, that Aaron Miller over at Foreign Policy has published an article referring to something called the Barack Romney foreign policy, saying that the foreign policy of the two is basically indistinguishable, which I actually object to on substantive grounds, and I will go into greater length on that. But there is also the question, if, say, on Iran, on Afghanistan, one candidate can't actually enunciate a policy alternative that when you get past all the rhetoric sounds very different, how much does political rhetoric, how much does campaign rhetoric actually matter?
I am making a giant zero sign at the camera. I think this has been a consistent theme of mine, which is I really don't think that campaign promises on foreign policy, and let me be very clear here, I'm making a distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy. I think the campaign pledges of domestic policy actually do count for a fair amount because voters remember that stuff. Voters don't care about foreign policy, let's be blunt. And so as a result, you know, I do think that by and large what campaigns say about foreign policy doesn't in the end matter that much. You know, I mean, and again, let's go back to what happened in 2008. You know, I think we've had this conversation before. But, you know, if Barack Obama had actually implemented the foreign policy that he claimed he was going to in 2008, you know, I think the U.S. would have renegotiated NAFTA. You know, Obama would have been happy to have sat down with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. To be fair, he did say he would go into Pakistan to get bin Laden, so you got to give him credit on that one. That was a campaign pledge he actually kept to. And I think, you know, kudos for that one. But, you know, I think there's two levels on this. The first is that, let's face it, campaigns often say a lot of things on foreign policy they never have any intention of implementing. This is entirely an exercise in pleasing various constituencies in their own party. And then there are the times where perhaps the rhetoric is actually genuinely intended. In other words, the candidate or whoever's, you know, coming up with the rhetoric really does think they're going to do that. But what happens is that even if they make even a slight move towards implementing it, the cruel shoals of foreign policy